I think the story really started about 1992 or so, when I was just cleaning out some things from my father's basement, and I noticed a sort of an old metal filing cabinet, two-door filing cabinet. Must have been from the 40s or 30s, and I opened it up, and there were some old file folders in it. I started to look through them. I didn't pay too much attention, but I thought they were interesting and sort of remembered that they were there.
So, what did you discover in these folders that intrigued you?
Well, eventually I found a whole drawer full of material about some cousins, relatives from Romania, from northern Romania, a county called Mara-Mureș County, which is near a city called Sighet, and which is well known, I guess, in Jewish circles, because that's where Elie Wiesel is from. And but the letters were mostly from just after the war. There was some pre-war material, but there were some letters from right after the war from people who said they were relatives who needed help or wanted some direction or something, and they were quite gripping, actually.
Now, tell me when looking through these letters, is this where you found the reference to Michael Fried?
Yes. Well, I have a cousin who lives in New York State, and she's about 10 years older than I am. She mentioned his name to me a couple of times over the years, saying, had I ever learned anything about Michael Fried? And I really didn't know who he was. It turns out he was about a third cousin of mine, second cousin once removed or something, and it turned out that there were a lot of letters and correspondence with him in these file folders. When I started to go through them, I realized that this was really the story of someone who had survived the Holocaust, was able to make contact with relatives in Canada. His entire family was wiped out, and almost all of his friends were killed. It was pretty horrifying. But he was able to make contact with one of my grandfather's brothers because of some earlier communication before the war that they had had.
Tell me about that communication. How far back does it go, and how extensive was it?
Well, my great-grandfather, Michael Wiesel, and his family moved to Canada between 1902 and 1904. They came in 3 separate installments, I guess. My grandfather was the eldest of the children. His brother was a couple of years younger. His name was Joseph, and he had maintained some correspondence with a couple of cousins back in Romania. And he had one cousin in particular named Tzipora, who he was very fond of, and they tried to keep in touch a little bit. As I learned later, Michael Fried was one of her 2 sons.
So tell me, what kind of direct contact did members of your family have with the village of Sighet?
Well, my grandfather's family came from a small village called Boțișa, which is outside the city of Sighet. Sighet had about 20,000 people at the time, about almost half of which I think were Jewish, large proportion anyway. But a lot of the relatives did live in Sighet, including Tzipora and her family. And my great-grandfather went back to Romania in around 1912 or so, I think, and stayed there. And the war broke out. First World War broke out. He stayed there. He died in 1917, and he was buried there. And my Uncle Joe wanted to make sure he had a proper tombstone. So an opportunity came up in 1931 when there was a Rotary convention in Berlin, Germany, and my Uncle Joe was very active in the Rotary here, So he decided to go to the convention and then take a side trip to Romania. So he went there and arranged with my cousin Michael to get a tombstone for my great-grandfather. And then a little while later, Michael wrote to him and told him what the cost had been and so on. And there were a few things like that. There was also a letter in which my cousin Michael's mother had enclosed an outline of the shape of her foot that she had drawn on a piece of newspaper. My uncle had asked for that because the Weasels were in the shoe business. So he used that piece of paper, which I have, and was able to send her footwear, which was
Footwear from St. John, New Brunswick to Sighet, Romania.
to Sighet, Romania, in the mid-30s. It was a very, very poor place. The people there were not entirely unhappy, but they had a lot of poverty. They enjoyed a lot of poverty.
Coming forward to the Second World War, the war ended, and then what happened at the end of that war that brought Michael Fried to the attention of your family in St. John?
Yes, well, there's a telegram which was in the file folders. It was when I saw it the first time, I was startled because it was a 10-word message and a signature and the name at the bottom, and it was addressed to my Uncle Joe Weasel. I think it was addressed to Messrs. Weasel or something. Michael was able to write in English, so he knew he knew the address of my uncle in St. John, more or less, and they were well known here anyway. So all he had to do was have an opportunity to send a telegram. So in July of 1945, he sent this very dramatic telegram saying that he had been liberated from the camp.
And so this launched a period of several years of correspondence between Michael Fried and your Uncle Joe?
It was more than just my Uncle Joe. My Uncle Joe and his sister Doris, who we called Aunt Dolly, and his sister Annie in New York, and his sister Rose in New York. They were the main four people. So Joe was the initial contact, but then Aunt Dolly became sort of the corresponding secretary. She made sure that everybody had copies of all the letters going in both directions. Michael really badly needed financial assistance, and they sent it. In fact, going through the documents, there were a lot of receipts for bank drafts or money orders, which was impressive, to say the least.
How much money was sent over to him at that period of time?
Well, they were in batches of about $100 each, and there must have been 20 or 30 of them. Now, $100 in 1945 to 48 was probably
a lot more money than it is
something
today.
like $1,000 now or something.
Right.
So it was a pile of money, yeah, and enough to live on, I guess.
So the family in St. John were Michael Fried's only living relatives that he knew
Yes.
of.
That's right. It was the Red Cross and other agencies collected information from survivors. Survivors could write their names on lists, and they could look at the lists for people they might know. And so there was this kind of two-directional matching system. It was pretty good, but the sad part is that there weren't very many people on the lists who knew each other because the Holocaust had been so destructive. But so he was in a good position, actually. He had his own contacts here, but also he could help find other people's relatives because he did work for the Red Cross. After a few months, he was able to get some work with them.
So the letters you found in the file cabinets, these were the letters that made up the correspondence between Michael Fried and different members of your family in the late 40s.
Yes, he wrote some letters to each of the four main people involved at this end. And Aunt Dolly they would be sent to Aunt Dolly. She would retype them all with carbon copies, and then send them out to the people who hadn't received the initial letter. And that's why a lot of the typed letters from Michael are on Weasel Shoe Store stationery.
Like they were retyped
Yeah, that's
locally.
right. And so, and there was a few other things involved as well, but mostly letters and making sure everybody had as much information as possible.
And that included a letter from Michael Fried's wife, who wrote a letter of introduction.
After they were trying very hard to get Michael over here, they enlisted the help of my grandmother's brother. My grandmother was married to Herman Weasel, the eldest of the seven siblings, and her brother, one of her brothers, was a lawyer in the U.S. and was trying to have him get immigration permission to the U.S. There were quotas, and it was very, very difficult to get people in, and
especially Jews.
Yeah, I was thinking in particular of the Jewish people, yeah. And so because of that difficulty, things were slow. He had been given permission to immigrate, I think, to the U.S. before the war, but because of the war, everything had to go back to square one. And that really made it difficult, I guess.
So what did all of these, all of the correspondence, all of this history tell you about your family? Why was it so fascinating to you?
Well, there are two or three levels of this, really. Of the four branches of my grandparents' families, I knew a fair amount about three of them. The fourth one, which is the Weasel side, was sort of mysterious. Or unknown anyway to me, and I thought it would be interesting to learn more. And then there's the Holocaust thing, because as a young person growing up in the 50s and 60s, I wasn't told, the kids weren't told much about the Holocaust. We knew it had been terrible, and there were a lot of people killed and so on, but it wasn't really talked about. I mean, the lost relatives weren't discussed. It was kind of, I think it might have been sort of to protect us or something, the way people do sometimes. In any case, it never came up that I can remember anyway. And the family side, I mean. So I became interested much later when I was, we're talking about the 1990s or so. I started to become interested in that side of it. And then there's the third thing, which is just the general genealogical thing, just finding out where it went, sort of. And my grandfather Weasel always thought, he was sure that somehow he was related to Elie Wiesel, but I still haven't been able to verify that. The fact that their surnames were the same and they came from the same place didn't necessarily prove much. One of my cousins, the one in New York, asked Elie Wiesel personally if they might be related, and he said there are an awful lot of Weasels in the world. The name Weasel is sort of a joke in our family, even though it's a family name.
Do you think there's a common story between your family's history and a lot of other Jewish families in St. John?
There are several families here who kind of know where their grandparents or ancestors came from in Europe. And the places vary quite a lot, actually. But the idea that they can trace them back, or that they want to trace them back, I'm not sure. There are a few who do pay attention to that, and they try to connect with other families who live in other places who are from the same districts and that sort of thing.
I guess in part the significance is that many of the families that left Eastern Europe, Jewish families, left because of for reasons of persecution and extreme economic poverty. And I guess that's the common denominator for those families coming to seek a better life in North America, settling in St. John?
For a lot of them, some came just because they were in a good economic situation and wanted to have a better one. A lot of them were persecuted, wanted to get away from that, and because they were persecuted, of course, a lot of them didn't have resources.
What kind of reaction do you think you'll get talking about your family history like this? The fact that you can trace through letters different branches of of the Wiesel family to a European town.
I think that a lot of people, whether the Jewish community or otherwise, might find it interesting that this can be done or has been done, and the ones who can't do it or haven't done it can relate to this. They can sort of say, "Well, my family probably went through something like that," and it's good to, or it's helpful somehow, give some kind of closure maybe to know that this kind of thing, how it happened anyway. It's not good to know, it's just something that one knows happened, and you can follow the sort of logic or non-logic of it.
Now you've talked about being interested because you've now had contact with Michael Fried's son to actually go one step forward and perhaps travel to Stockholm to meet him, Kai,
Yeah.
and his mother, who's still
Yes,
alive.
and one of his brothers, and I think his aunt, and other family members, his children. I think does he have a grandchild now? Anyway, yeah, there's a whole family over there now, and they've done well. If they came here, they would probably say something similar. Not maybe St. John anymore, but yes, it's a community and it's a family, and they're interesting people, and
they're your relatives.
They are my relatives. He would be my third cousin, which is reasonably close. Much, his father was my mother's second cousin, which is pretty close indeed.
So obviously a lot of interest.
Yeah, a very diverse family. We have yes.
Sorry, but a lot of
Yeah.
interest by you to find out more about this branch of your family who
Yeah,
you never really knew existed until you found these letters.
that's right. Yeah, and I think it might work both ways, because when I told him that about how his father, I read him the telegram. I sent him a copy of it, and it said send money or something, and he said, "Did they send money?" And I said, "Yeah, they did quite a bit." He said, "Well, thank you very much." Thank you very much. This is some years later, right? Mm-hmm. 60 years later or more. And so I think there's a bond of certainly more than just somebody interesting from far away.
This is part of your family story.
I guess it is. I mean, I know it is. Yes, it is.
So obviously this search for your family's history has turned up some interesting information, and it must mean quite a lot to you.
Yes, it really does. I'm glad I did it. I've learned a lot, and meeting interesting people. Some of them aren't my relatives, but they're interesting and have common interests, and I think some good is going to come from it.